Welcome to the second online learning session. In this session, we're going to be looking at a couple of key terms and themes that are useful for helping us to understand Paul's letters more. And to do this, we're going to look at two reading methods. We're going to look at literary criticism or form criticism, where the form, structure and content of a letter is examined. And then we're going to look at socio-historical or cultural historical criticism, where the real-world context of the original writer and the people they're writing to is taken into account. We're then going to move on to look at three key terms: Christology, eschatology, and Gnosticism. So let's dive straight on in with our reading methods. When approaching biblical texts, it's important to remember that the original readers and writers lived in a very different social, political, theological and philosophical world to us in the Western world today. And that doesn't mean that the texts are impossible to understand or interpret. It just means that the world in which they lived might actually be a useful tool in helping us do that. And this is especially important when reading Paul's letters, because Paul's letters were responses to other letters and questions or issues that were raised by people on his journeys. So as a result, we're kind of hearing one half of a broader conversation, and taking into account their world is going to help us to fill in the gaps on what he might be responding to in between. In Horrell's words, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of the fact that Paul lived and wrote in a society far removed from ours in terms of both time and culture. And this also means that reading the Bible today, we have to be aware of our own position in history and grapple with what these texts might mean for us in our own contexts. And in terms of a critical reading of the Bible, what that means is seeing what might be applicable now in light of what it meant historically to its first readers. So when scholars speak of historical cultural criticism, they're largely referring to the way in which a text can be placed in relation to its writer and its original readers and hearers, both socially and historically. Form criticism, or literary criticism, on the other hand, is more associated with the purpose and shape of a text and how it can relate to a particular situation in life. So questions that are raised by form criticism would be things like, did Paul refer to the body metaphor for Christ because that was something that his readers would understand? Or what was Paul's purpose in writing his letter to Philemon? By attempting to sort of read the intention behind a text, we can sometimes get a better idea of the tone and the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, nudges that a writer might be making to lead their readers to understand something perhaps a little bit differently. So that covers our reading methods. We'll move now on to looking at our key terms. So Christology, put simply, is discussion about the person of Christ. But Evans has cautioned that we need to be careful of anachronism in reading back later creedal statements of the Church into New Testament texts. And what Evans is saying here is essentially that the Church has built up all these ideas over the past 2,000 years, things like Jesus being fully human and fully divine, the second person of the Trinity, that are doctrines that are not quite fully spelled out in the New Testament. And so our task is to sort of approach these texts without expecting to find things that might not necessarily be there. So in the letters of Paul, the emphasis seems to be directed towards how Jesus acts, as opposed to who Jesus is in relation to God. He speaks in many places of Jesus' significance in God's divine plan for salvation. So for Paul, the fact that the long-awaited Messiah came and proved himself to be the Christ by dying on a cross is this radical, unexpected thing. And it's from that event that flows all of this kind of idea of new creation. So when talking about Paul's Christology, it's often in relation to how Jesus acted on the cross, what that means for people, and as a result, how Jesus is presently working in and through his people to achieve new creation in the world. And that leads us quite nicely into our second key term, eschatology. And eschatology is a word that basically relates to discussion on the end times, or the eschaton. And Paul's theology is possibly best described as being inaugurated, meaning that he understood the end times to be in a process of coming to completion. And that drives a lot of his teaching. So, for example, his recommendation that it's better to remain unmarried because the end times would soon be coming anyway. Therefore, a lot of Paul's theology sits in this interesting sort of position of already, but not yet. And what that means is that through the crucifixion and resurrection, and in the life and work of the church, the end times are currently happening. However, the full realization of these end times, in which new creation will come to completion, is yet to happen. So in Paul's letters then, there's a balance between discussion on how the church should act now so that it can be righteous in anticipation of the point at which God becomes all in all, which leads us again into our next key term, Gnosticism. Gnosticism has a whole broad range of key features, but the one that mostly relates to discussion on Paul is this idea that the material world can be rejected in favour of a higher spiritual world. So, in this view, things like knowledge are seen as sort of highly favourable, and bodily desires, such as food or sex, are seen as almost lesser, undesirable things. And if a person held this view, it's easy to see how sort of physical desires could become a commodity of little concern, in which your soul is seen as a thing that you need to cultivate and your body really doesn't mean all that much. So there are people who have argued that the Corinthian church were quite heavily influenced by something that looked like a very early form of Gnosticism. Perhaps even the church in Ephesus was influenced by this as well. And when we see in Paul's letters him responding to issues about sexual immorality or food or people who are boasting in knowledge, that he's responding to issues that are of early sort of Gnostic thought. And that brings us to the end of our key terms. So just a quick recap. There are two useful reading methods for studying Paul: cultural historical, which looks at the world around him, and literary or form criticism, which looks at how and what he wrote. The key terms we've looked at are Christology, which is about Jesus, eschatology, which is about the end times, and Gnosticism, which is about focusing more on your spirit than your body. And understanding all these things is going to help us to identify where Paul addresses these particular sort of key issues and how that fits in with his overall theology. So I hope that's geared you up a little bit more for reading Paul's letters, and I'll see you in Online Learning 3.